the made a huge intervention in terms of challenging the traditional ASA, the African Studies Association, and its sort of Eurocentrism, as well as its sort of ways in which it was the gatekeeper, for African history, from the Melville Herskovitz and others. Now, that being said, I then began to, as the diaspora discussions began to heat up again in the course of the early in the sort of early to mid 1990s. I was a graduate student from, starting about 1993. And I had cut my teeth as a history major at Morehouse College, where I was actually influenced by this sort of resurgent interest in Africa. In fact, I'm a member of an organization called KEMET, which is the first African fraternity in the US that was founded in 1988, and then went on to spawn other groups. But the point being is that, yes, so I teach African-American history, and I always begin on the African continent. You probably know this already, but if you go and you look at any of the major kind of survey texts on African-American history, all of them have attempted in some respects to begin in Africa, to sort of, take that challenge, whether it's, older pieces by John Hope Franklin that's been reworked, or whether it's, the Darlene Clark Hine and others with African American Odyssey, which I use. Africa, of course, is the starting point. So that's my orientation. I come out of that tradition. The continent is central in a beginning point. Now, we have the orientation and we have a position, but then we have the intellectual challenge, right? And the intellectual challenge, and you see it in the text, like it's always like the Africa piece is there, but it's like we shoot through thousands of years of history, really quickly. But to establish the point that our history doesn't start in enslavement, but at the same time, it's very difficult to be comprehensive, right? I'm part of a thing. We actually we're relaunching our African history class. We used to have two at Pasadena City College before I got here, and now we're collapsing them into one long history of the continent, largely because of enrollment and people, taking the course, and two, because we needed to downsize and streamline. So I've been part of that initiative to, to bring African history back and make it part of the curriculum. So I'm 100% there with you. The question is, how do we organizationally, provide a certain kind of punch in that direction? And align it with where you're going. I did get a chance, Amiri, to read your take, and I saw where you were going with, in terms of teaching the spirit and grounding in African history and so forth. I was just actually reading Abdullah Kalimat's, piece on book on Black studies, and he again attempts to tap into Mali and other examples of African higher learning. Look at the first Black Ph.D. to go into Europe, and to also just think about sort of, Africa writ large in terms of its intellectual contributions to the planet and to the world. So, yeah, so the question is this, it's not about, if it should be done. It's obvious it should be done. The question is how, right? How do we execute it? How do we shoot, introduce students in community college to this area, hit on and agree to, whatever the 3, 4, 5, 6 touch points that we want to cover to get the point across. And then at the same time, how do we align that, of course, with all the other chapters? And so when I got into this recently, and I was like, man, I was, like I said, I was out of the loop. And then when I got into it, I was like, damn, okay, I'm doing the intellectual. I'm like, whoa. So I had to start really excavating and going back into a lot of my old stuff, as well as looking at a lot of the new scholarship that's come out, and to sort of think about how do we, engage in this kind of synthesis. And so I think that probably the best place to start, one, is if we all agree, on that position, I think that you put forth, and I absolutely agree, around Africa as a starting point. Two, collectively thinking about what we want to highlight, right? What really captures the critical point that we're trying to get across, and that is that, you know, where we are now and where we've been in North America is this is a very, very recent and a very, very small part of our history, though significant, right? And of course that's important. So I'm open, you know, to tapping into the collective, and maybe one place to start in that regard is to sort of maybe make a suggestion box of, you know, like I said, 3, 4, 5, 6 critical areas that we want to highlight. Of course, you have the traditional West African kingdoms. You know, you have Egypt, and the discussions around the impact of Ethiopia and Nubia in those spaces. Of course, the centrality of Black people to ancient Africa, et cetera, et cetera. You move into, of course, West Africa. You talk about oftentimes, ecological and geographical difference and how that shaped those various communities. Oftentimes religion, spirituality, orientations toward land, Islamic incursion, this kind of standard things that exist, right? And the question is, what do we want to highlight, and what would really anchor Black studies for, as an introductory text for students? And again, it really just comes down to like what we select. It's no like, oh, you didn't do that, because the biggest thing we always struggle with as teachers is, what do we teach and what do we leave out? It's not that we, because you just can't do it all. Yeah.
I just kind of want to open it up, Alexis or Jasmine, would kind of think about your thoughts based off what we're discussing, or share your thoughts based off what we're discussing.
For myself, I had conversations with Keandra earlier in this week, and talking about overlap within each person's contribution. And just because, I know, Amiri, you had a section on Afrofuturism, but it's for myself, how are we going to engage? So say you covered it and you lay it down. However, I'm looking at culture and especially art, and it's how do I not, I'm going to have to touch on it to some extent, right? So it's how do we, I guess, lay down these foundations that we have and allow them to kind of intersect within each person's sections, where it doesn't sound redundant. Yeah. That's my biggest thing, where it's I gotta touch on it, but I don't want to, if you're laying down the whole thing, then it's I just want to touch upon it about artists and how it's importance within culture, but not reiterate the whole subject again. And I think that's the hardest part, is because it's you can't touch on certain pieces, and it's gonna overlap regardless, right? Because it's if I'm gonna talk about Black radical tradition, there are probably going to be some elements within Keandra's Black feminism, right? Or even with yours within education, because it comes out of these different movements and affects art. So I think that for me, that's the hardest part, is where do we go? Or I guess for me, when I'm writing my section, is how do I write it where it's not just repeating, but either building off of or taking a different perspective of it.
One thing I was thinking about, Alexis, as I was listening to you, because one of the fundamental aspects of Afrofuturism is art, right, and art critique. So now what I did real quick is look at how the chapters are laid out. I'm chapter 3 and you're chapter 6. So for example, what could be done, right? I could talk about the theoretical implications of Afrofuturism, because that's really where I situate myself. I'm more in the theory of Afrofuturism. But within that, I can introduce how Afrofuturism is manifested as an arts movement, as an art critique, as a visual aesthetic, right? And that can open the way to your chapter. Now, I can say something in chapter 6, we'll illuminate in greater detail how Afrofuturism plays in the art scene. And that will kind of give you the space to kind of go wherever you want, but also be attached to what the previous work was talking about. You know what I mean? I think if we all kind of be cognizant of that, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Kind of provide introductions to other people's work that will allow you to kind of not sound redundant, but then explore that space that I really.
Yeah. So I think that was just kind of my major concern when I was talking to Keandra. Is just we want to have these through lines and these connections, but at the same time, not repeating, right?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And I think you're spot on, because that's one thing about Africana studies. It's so interdisciplinary and there's so many like cross sections of it. It all really can lead to everything, but at the same time, there is a specificity there that we want to be able to highlight as well. Jasmine, do you want to chime in, or do you have any thoughts?
It's hard for me to think right now with this corona brain that I have going on. I feel like I have cloudy brain.
Yeah, you say you got the COVID brain? Is that shit?
Yeah, I got COVID.
In Texas.
Yeah.
Yeah. My apologies, sis. So yeah, just then don't trip. I ain't gonna put nothing on you unnecessarily. But I guess that's just kind of we'll keep this in the back of your mind as you're kind of recuperating. I'm just trying to kind of drive this conversation about style home without any prompts or anything of that nature.
I think for me, my biggest thing is like I only have one chapter, so there's so much that I could put into Black Psych. So that's been my struggle. Like my friend told me, just throw everything on and see what sticks, and then organize it, and then cut stuff out that might be too much. So that's where I've been at when I was writing, but I haven't been writing for about a week because I got sick. So there's that.
But and I think to that point though, kind of to what Fanon was saying, like, what do we want to highlight? And I know he was speaking specifically towards like Africa, but I think also within the project, right? Like, what are some of the main things as a collective that we think are imperative, that we want to make sure that the readers are walking away with? And I think once we kind of get that centered, that can kind of help you, Jasmine, in the sense of what will stick or what's important or where to go within. Because you're right, like Black psychology is such an enormous field. But I think once we all kind of get a collective essence of where we want this to go and some of the main points that we want to touch on, it will kind of make that work easier for us. Because I'm with you, like I'm writing my dissertation on education right now, so I got like hella shit that I could pull from, but it's like, how do you narrow it down to make sure that it's all gonna merge to what we're all talking about as a collective?
Jasmine, I was sitting there thinking as you were talking, I was again, the interesting thing is that we're engaged obviously in a field that continues to be like building a plane as we fly it, right? It's been perpetually that way, and you can go to any Black studies text where worth its salt that's attempting to try to theorize and think through the field or fields. And everybody has a different way of organizing things, right? And so there's always like I was thinking about sort of like on the one hand, like one of the things I might do in terms of maybe in terms of thinking about Black thought is also thinking about sort of the disciplinary interventions, right? And so we know, like, just from and this history much better than I do, just sort of the various Black people that went into psychology, right, in a formal sense, and got PhDs from 1920 to 1950. The first of which was a Black woman, and then so in that sense, that's part of the Black studies history and movement, right? That first of all, Black people had an interest in this particular space, went into this particular space with particular kinds of questions, whether it's the Clarks or, and others who, of course, would play a role in Brown versus Board of Education or, with their experiments and so forth, and moving on. So the point is that just from an institutional and educational perspective, we have a history of Black psychology in terms of Black people in the field. And then, of course, you're obviously doing a much more granular look, granular dive into the various theories and ideas and practices that come out of the field that have advanced how we think about it. So one of the ways I'm thinking about what I do is to set folks up for that, right? Like you said. So again, that's an area, given the fact that I was looking at art, literature, so obviously if we're talking about excavating, in terms of where art fits in Black studies, and of course, the ways in which institutions and organizations supported artists, from Zora Neale Hurston and NAACP and the Crisis to all the stuff that we see, of course, that emerges in the 1960s, the Black arts movement. on down through, hip hop, and, we can go on and on. So the point being is that I'm learning through reading you all's, initial pieces, like, okay, here are the areas that we need to, kind of focus in on, and that can also, be amplified in what I do. And part of why I think that when I first looked at this thing and saw what was proposed, I was like, whoa, damn, like, what do I, with Black thought, you know what I'm saying? Like where do I start with this? You know what I mean? And I think a big part of where I start is also what the book collectively is going to come up with. And so I have a better sense. So anyway, just wanted to throw that in there as I was thinking about it.
And, like, listen to you, Fanon, because kind of what I'm hearing you map out is somewhat of a genealogy in this term, in this case, like a Black psychology within the academic, right, space. And I think that's something that may be useful or generative for all of us to kind of incorporate within our sections, right? So for me, it's maybe like a genealogy of education, radical education within the fields, within the university, right? And how does that evolve? And then from there, we kind of go into these different type of spaces. And I know for me, I'm going to be looking at, within the classroom space, and then also outside the classroom space with this like undercommon type of Black study space as well. But I do think it's important that since we are talking about a discipline that operates within the institution of the academy, right? Like we do kind of speak to how this evolves and how this comes to be, and I know for me, it's activism, right? And I think that's going to be a central thread into how I'm going to be discussing the evolution of education within that discipline of Africana studies. But I think you're spot on in the sense of us adding some type of evolution, some type of genealogy, or just tracing the historical evolution of whatever we're looking at as it pertains to the academy. But also like how we subvert the academy too. You know what I'm saying? I don't want to be so overdetermined about honoring this ivory tower, right? Like it's also about kind of tearing down some of these restrictive systems.
Yeah, that's I've been playing with my, if anyone's got a chance to even look some of the stuff, I've just been working on it recently, playing with my introduction. One of the things I put in there is sort of the centrality of the Black public sphere in terms of the fact that so much of our intellectual work has been produced outside of academic spaces, right? And of course, has influenced, those academic spaces. So taking somebody like a James Turner, who was the founder of and an organizer of Africana Studies at Cornell, but was shaped through his being on the streets of Harlem, listening to Malcolm X, and then also becoming mentored by Malcolm X, and then going to graduate school, and then returning back to New York City and being shaped by all the sort of Black student tumult that was happening during that period, who then recruited him to be the first head of the Africana Studies program at Cornell. So if you even take someone like Turner in his intellectual development and history, you see exactly what you're talking about. A huge part of our intellectual work is not in these institutions, but these institutions also have a robust impact in different ways. Like there's obviously your field, education, that's been central to Black people, from the beginning, but of course was amplified post-Reconstruction, coming out of slavery, Civil War. We know Black teachers, we know what it meant for the South. Black folks, instituted public education in the South for everybody, you know what I mean? Like we know all that, right? And so it's like, these are areas where we are, very, very concentrated, and hit hard. And then there's other areas where we may have less, we may not be as we may not have the numbers or the impact, but, our presence is still there. So again, I guess, and I'm curious to ask you all just in terms of how this was conceptualized, like in terms of the book project and maybe folks will just give me a few, just give me some background because I wasn't in here for the early conversations, like how the chapters and the ideas sort of congeal to be what they are. Is it just based on the expertise of everyone who's interested, or is it more or less like, this is what we think is probably the better approach to thinking through the field?
You know, to be real with you, Fanon, to my understanding, like this was what our meeting today was supposed to be about, like really kind of hammering a lot of that out.
Right.
To my understanding, when Keandra and David first picked up the project, they were more under the impression that it would be like an accumulation of essays that we're bringing together to talk about Africana studies. And then based off of that, right, like Keandra knew that I was working on education. She knows that Lex's work is involved with the arts movement, right? So we kind of pull people in. But really, like the intention of today's meeting was kind of like to map those things out, because we really don't have that. And I think that ambiguity is kind of like, maybe for me, I can speak for myself, right? It's kind of pushing my work on pause, because I want to know like where to go. You know what I mean? And I want to make sure that we all going on the same route. So and it's kind of hard because we ain't all here to really
right
in its fullness. But hopefully within, you know, the last half hour we got together, we kind of get some kind of essence of what the direction of this will be, you know, some of the important themes that we want to touch on as a unit.
Absolutely.
Alexis, you want to chime in on that, or did
Yeah, I think for me, I was talking to Kendra, private conversation was just like, how much room do we have? Right? Because it's like, because I even told her, I was like, if you got 20 pages and you're trying to cover X, Y, and Z, it's like, you know, you're gonna have to make some editorial cuts. Simple, like, I can't talk about everything. Like, I can't go. I mean, you can write a book about jazz. You can write a book, you know what I mean? Like, some of the topics we can touch about deserve entirety of work. So it's, how do you provide a best survey, right, for a student? I think also too cognizant of our students. Like, are we writing, like, you know what I mean? It's like, yes, this is for the academy, but yes, it's a teaching tool, right? So how do we make it tangible, you know, and still talking about elevated concepts, but making it tangible for the average day student, right? It's supposed to be for community college, and it's supposed to be for X, Y, Z. Like, this isn't a graduate student who's going to use this. You know, this is probably most likely going to be an intro or maybe a specified version, within the first, year or 2 year student. Like, so,
ask you all, anyone here, how many people here use OER?
I use it in all my classes.
You do, Jasmine?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I provide open resources, but not like a textbook like this. I've never taught of a textbook that's strictly an OER textbook.
That's why I was asking that, because I was wondering if anyone here is familiar with the textbook as a great model, like just as an example of, like, whatever the field, like, like they did a great job in blah, 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 blah. I like the way it was organized. Because as you know, and I've been learning this, in the last year, is just how much structure our students crave, right? And so if it ain't structured, if it ain't, boom, we're doing ourselves a disservice. And so part of me doesn't want to overthink and get so granular and get into my, my nerd academic, because that's what happens. I just go right into that. And I'm really trying to think, and I've never written accessibility text with a certain kind of accessibility for our student population. So I'm coming on it from from into the community college space, from a research one space. And so I'm just trying to orient myself, right? And so I will definitely appreciate any guidance or insight folks have in that direction. And I was just wondering if there was an existing model that we could actually look at and say, okay, this is effective, or people have used this in this field and that field, and they found that these resources work very well. Because I've looked at some of the history stuff, and there's stuff that's not terrible, but there's stuff that's just like, I wouldn't use that. You know what I mean? And I think this is an evolving ecosystem organism. So that's why I was curious if folks had any idea.
I think Johnson put a link to a OER book.
Okay. Oh, cool. All right, let me link that. Perfect.
And I think to your point, Fanon, like, for us, we ain't got to look for the material, you know what I'm saying? It's just how they place the material on paper. That's what, you know what I mean? Like, formatting, like, fuck what they say. Like, they could be talking about some bullshit, but as long as, like, the way that they're formatting it, that's what's going to be generative for us. You know what I'm saying?
Exactly. Yeah.
But yes, that link that Jasmine shared, I think it's an ethnic studies.
I'm looking at it right now. Yep. Yeah. So yeah, this is, yeah, I was just wondering, because I'm thinking if we think about a model, and then it seems like kind of a, you know, like a, so it seems like we're kind of outlining, like we're outlining from our own discipline and area, but we really need to talk about a collective outline for the entire book. You know what I mean? And that to me is almost like the starting place. And again, I don't want to, I know I'm late here, so I'm not trying to come and, you know, and overturn or disrupt the process. And I respect what everybody's been doing so far. I'm just trying to just for myself, figure out how to, you know, how we can proceed in a way that's seamless and connected. And I'm wondering about just a general skeleton outline for the entire project, where we just kind of like, we have base pieces that we, you know, that we all do, introduction, key, you know, whatever, you know, like, it seems like we could probably come to some collective, you know, decision about like the structure of it, so that, you know, there's some connection. Obviously we all write different, and, you know, the editorial stuff, we'll figure that out, but at least the structure should be consistent, I think, as a textbook for pedagogical purposes and teaching purposes. You know, it should be kind of that way, so that our students can, you know, really, you know, work through it.
I think with that being said, like, correct me if I'm wrong, the outline should be kind of similar, should be uniform, correct? So like the way that they have the sections sectioned off within the outline, that should kind of, it should be able to serve as that, right? I'm gonna try to pull mine back up. And that could kind of help with that, but I think you're right. And one of the biggest things for me that you said that I'm going to ask you all as peer reviewers to kind of really be on me with, because I'm like currently dissertating, like I'm in like that dissertation mode. So I'm sure a lot of my language and my jargon will not be accessible to like a junior college level, right? So please, you know, be unabashed about like letting me know like, yo, you got to scale this shit back, or, you know what I mean? I'm open for that. But and correct me if I'm wrong, like, so for example, section 1 is the context and foundation of the chapter. Section 2 is key theorists, movements, and principles. Section 3 is the positions in the field, so the varying positions. Section 4 is opportunities and possibilities, and then I believe each section closes with futurity, so like future options within, in my case, education. So that's a rough outline, you know, and I think within that phenomenon, we could kind of still be a little bit more uniform and collective in how we approach that. For example, like that genealogy piece that was mentioned earlier, that could be something that we all, just for example, agree upon, that maybe goes in the, let me see, and maybe like section 2, right? Like the key theorists and movements and principles. So maybe what we could do is like within each section, excuse me, maybe come to a conclusion as to how we want to approach that section collectively. Like, are there some key elements that we feel must be attached to that section? Because I think that's one thing that David did kind of provide us, is with that skeleton outline through these sections. But I think even within that, we may be able to get a little bit more uniform.
And the other pieces, I guess, for me, is one of the challenges is the disciplinary differences in disciplinary approach, right? Like, for example, I'm a historian, transit historian. We don't, you know, oftentimes historians, we don't spend a lot of time engaging in historical theory, right? So theoretical interventions are not necessarily a real area that we focus in on per se. Not to say that there are people who don't do that, but generally speaking, at least from where I'm coming from, that's not that area. It's like, I remember being in graduate school and everybody would say, you know, I would have political scientists come and say, tell me, man, what's your theoretical framework? And I'd be like, well, that is to be seen. As I get into the archives and construct what I'm doing, then I can theorize once I'm at that particular place, but I'm not necessarily always starting with a, and so there's a way in which the social sciences start with a hypothesis, et cetera, et cetera. And, you know, so those type of things are just different approaches. And then it creates assumptions that everybody is discipline kind of functions in the same way when you create these categories. And so that's what I was trying to grapple with just personally. I see the logic, and I think it has a lot of merit. I'm just trying to like zero in on like just how we can, bring the psychology and the education and art and history, together. Because I think, Amiri, what I was read in your piece is like, even though you're focused in on teaching and education, it's inherently historical. So you kind of tapping into a lot of historical stuff that's critical and important. And then we historians, we think everybody should be historical. You know what I mean? Like it's all that kind of, so I'm just trying to get it to like, again, not to belabor stuff, but just to, it's an interesting exercise, and it's great that we're working through it and thinking through it, because it'll pay dividends down the line.
I think that's where Shagun will be really helpful. She's like our project manager.
Right.
From last week's conversation, she says like, while there has to be this uniformity, you do have a little bit of freedom within your chapter to kind of speak to your method, and so to speak, right? So like, for example, within section 1, which is the what's that shit? The context and foundation of the chapter, right? Like I can explain, for example, I'm coming from a cultural studies background, so I'm dealing specifically with theory, right? There'll be elements of my work that will touch on history. There'll be elements of my work that'll be pedagogical, but like my training as a cultural studies practitioner is pure theory. And so for this section, you'll be doing a theoretical exercise, right? For this section, as a Pan-Africanist, I'll be using African as an all-encompassing term to signify all African people throughout the diaspora, right? So these will be like the specificities of my section that I'll outline within my section 1, that will kind of speak to my method, that will speak to some of the terminology that will be used that may be different from separate chapters. And I'm trying to like pull what I remember from last week's conversation, where Shagun says we do have that liberty to kind of, set up your chapter in a specified way that may have a slight variation from other chapters in the book. Am I remembering that correctly, Alexis or Jasmine, if y'all recall?
Yeah, I mean, I think what you were saying was, there's like an outline. It's how you want to use it and how you want to, actually build out your chapter. Because like for me, it's like the way I'm setting mine up is like, if I'm gonna talk about culture, I gotta define it. So it's like, before we can even get to like theorists and movements, I have to define what culture is, how is it manifested. So it's like building off of individuals' theories. Like I'm building off of Stuart Hall's definition of culture, right? Going into, intangible cultural heritage, like what is cultural heritage? So it's like, how do I get to these sections before I even get to then let's talk about art, or let's talk about, hip hop, let's talk about fashion. Why is it significantly relevant within, the community? But it's just kind of how do I get that in? And then also thinking like, as a textbook, I gotta have definitions. Like, people are gonna, it's like, I think that's what I think for now we're talking about, like, how do we even build it where it's like, I'm thinking of definitions, what's important, where am I defining it, how am I defining it? Two, thinking about those, when I was looking at those textbooks, like the little pop outs, who do I want to highlight? How do I highlight them? Like, right, how is this going to be a section? And I think it's cool, like going and writing about it, but you also have to figure out while you're writing, is this going to be a pop out of George Clinton in Parliament? And I'm going to show you Afrofuturism, like manifested, like, through an album cover. Like, why is it important to think that way? Right? Or, deciding who gets cut, who doesn't. Like, you know what I mean? And I think I think for me, the biggest part was, how do you write it that way? Right? Because we've all written papers, we've all written articles, and it's like, yo, boom, I'm going into it and we're taking off. But how do we make it where it's like sectioned out like that?
So here, this is what I was thinking, like, in terms of the SLOs, right? I thought it was interesting. And for me, I was trying, and I looked at everybody's, and I was trying to say, okay, like, I know, and I'm sure this is at your institutions too. At our institution, we have a SLOs for the history department.
Yeah.
Right now, depending on your field, you fill in, but the SLO has been established by the history department for the department. So to me, it seems like the SLO should be for the textbook. I mean, there definitely should be an SLO for the textbook. Like, this is what we're doing. So back to your point of the different things, right? So like we think about I teach with the 5 W's in mind all the time: who, what, why, where, when, right? Like that's just a structure that students tap into. And, I want to who and what we're talking about, why are we talking about it, where, space, and when, you know what I mean? Period, time, as a historian. So the point being is that if we're all going to be introducing students to our field, if we're all going to be introducing students to the movements that undergird the creation of the field, if we're all going to be introducing students to key individuals, right? The SLOs, whether it's the Bloom's taxonomy, we want people to remember, like we should have at least some sense. We want people to remember some things. We want people to be able to synthesize some things and analyze whatever we come up with. We should be on the same board, and the book should be structured around those SLOs. And then, we, kind of make sure that our chapters tap into that specifically, so it has a symmetry. And each time they read the chapter on art, they're going to be like, oh, okay, here are the people I need to remember. Here are the key dates or figures. Here are the key debates, right? You know what I mean? So like, I just feel like if we can come up with our thing, and again, I'm not trying to reinvent the wheel. I'm just trying to build on what has already been put forth, because I can see, David, definitely that there's a real structure here. But it's just now that we're talking and I'm being able to talk to you, I'm like, okay, like I want to, because I can go so many places, and everybody here can go so many places because we got this vast amount of knowledge about particular areas. And to Jasmine's point earlier, like, just write as much as I can about Black Site, and we'll see what sticks, what we'll cut out, what we'll put in. But I think with a better little roadmap, we can all write to make sure that we deal with this part of SLO, this part of SLO, and this part of SLO, because we've all agreed on what that is as a text.
I think that may be something we could kind of take into next week's meeting. Like maybe we all write down SLOs for the textbook, right? And see which ones kind of speak to each other the best, and then go with that. I think it would be really instructive to have David on when we can get him on, because that way, between how he's thinking about what he's already mapped out and what you're asking, we can kind of come to that perfect consensus. But for me, the biggest takeaway, it really is dope having you on, bro, because I think what you're thinking about and the question that you're asking is perfect for where you're placed in the project. Like these are all the questions that need to be asked to open up the book, right? And I think you're placed in the perfect position, because I from what I'm gathering of how you're thinking about this project and how you're approaching it, you're really trying to set us all up for success. And really that's what that opening chapter is going to do. So everybody is just, to me, I'm just seeing a really divine alignment, right? Like, even though, you're saying, I don't want to overstep, and I came in late, but now, to be honest with you, bro, you're asking the questions that need to be asked for where we're at in the project, right? Because I think it's going to be yeah, we can continue to start writing right now based off what we have, but I could foresee with not having the question that you're asking answered, we're going to have to come back and redo some shit. That's just so I thank you for your approach to this, because it's really where we need to be, especially considering the chapter that you have. So to me, this is really positive, and I see it's although it feels like nothing's being done, but I do feel like some really good conversations are happening that's going to move us forward.
Well, this is the real, this is one of those classic examples where you have an idea, and then there's a kind of a created path to getting to that idea. But then when you get into the weeds of it, you realize okay, I don't know how much we can align with the theory. I know everybody wants to get paid and, for their labor and all that kind of stuff. And that's critical and important. But it's once you kind of sit down and realize just how big this project is, but also, it just requires a certain kind of refinement. Because I'm thinking about Carter G. Woodson is a central figure in the creation of Black studies. He's a historically created, important person. And then you, as an educator, he's at the heart of everything you do, right? You see what I'm saying? And so I'm going to cover Woodson and his activism, his education, his activism, his institution building. You're going to be probably talking about him in terms of pedagogy. He pops back up when you look at Black students, the central text they're reading in the 1960s as they begin to, institutionalize Black studies, miseducation, Negro, classic. You can't get around it. You know what I'm saying? So it's like, that's one of those examples of just like a particular historical thing that's important. You know what I mean? And you mentioned Parliament, Funkadelic, like, it's just, my mind goes all over the place with, like where we go, with this. So I just think it's great now, because now we're getting to, it's like, all right, now we're talking, and it's like, now we can really hash out and get a clear roadmap. And I think that we could probably all write a lot more effectively with a vision that we see, oh, okay, I'm writing towards Miri stuff. And okay, Jasmine's going to be laying out like this. Lex is going to be laying out this. Okay, Keandra's going to be here. You know what I mean? So yeah. So anyway, I think that like we should have some non-negotiables that everybody has to deal with in their chapters. You know what I mean? Like some non-negotiables. You need to be attentive to gender. You need to be attentive to like, there's just certain things. And so there's an alignment, do we want to highlight institutions and organizations, individuals, particular movements, debates, okay, make sure you include, 4 debates, or, like, so then there's just a level of symmetry moving forward. But I think it's great. I think where we started and where we are and what people have thrown out, I think it's a phenomenal place to start, to kind of hash out and figure out where we're going.
When I was kind of preparing for this project, I picked up this book here. It's been hella helpful. It's called The
Oh, wow. Okay. I don't even have that. Yeah.
I'll send a link of where I got it for y'all, because like really what it does, if you want to like have a definition for a term, like it's all of the terms.
There. Yeah.
Like it's the perfect resource. Say like, boom, I'm quoting, and then it's coming from Malefi Asati, who is like from Temple, right? Like he's the chair of the Africana Studies department there, like one of the progenitors of academic Black studies. So I'll send the link out for that text, so that way y'all can grab that. But I think also, Fanon, for what you're saying, like a lot of that will be done if we get these SLOs for the text, right? That's going to provide that uniformity. So what I'll do, what I suggest that we do is like, let's think about those and make that a part of our conversation for next week.
Okay.
Hopefully, Keandra and David can contribute to that as well. And then I think once we have like those textbooks, SLOs, it's gonna be like, all right, boom, I got this, I'm writing this. How does that speak to the SLO for the textbook, right? Kind of be like our guiding star to make sure that one, we're uniform, one, we're hitting those non-negotiables, right? And then it's just gonna be like this really cohesive and comprehensive text.
Excellent, man. I think that's awesome.
We got about 5 more minutes. Is there anything else y'all can think of or what we should touch on? All right. So I'll make sure that I'll try to get the recording out, so that way David and Keandra has that. I took some brief notes. I'll try to like put together minutes as best as I can. I'm gonna tell y'all now, I'm not like Keandra, homie. It ain't gonna be like that. It's just not in me. I don't get down like that. So I'll put together some notes, some rough estimates of what we talked about, and then I'll send out the recording as well. Other than that, try to keep Keandra's family in prayer.
Absolutely, man.
Utilize that right now.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, but I appreciate y'all making time. I hope you all enjoy the rest of your week. Jasmine, seeing you some health. Hope you get well. Thank you for trying to make your way here, even though you ain't feeling good.
Thank you.
Jasmine, are you taking anything for it? Or are you just working through it?
I was supposed to try to get my temperature regulated yesterday, and it was a struggle. But that's about it.
Yeah, I've had it 2, maybe 3 times. I think 3 times, and I just got to a point where I ain't even tested, man. I'm like, shit, if I got it, I got it. But I will say that the Paxlovid was, I'm not a medication person at all, but I did break down and do that Paxlovid, and it shot me right out, got me right out of it. So I'm an advocate on certain things, you know what I mean? I tend to shy away from all that stuff, but I found that to be effective.
I tried to contact Kaiser, and they were like, well, you're not sick enough, or they tried to tell me I wasn't like in need of it. And I'm like, okay,
Yeah,
you gotta fib a little bit to get what you need.
I know, right?
Yeah.
I was about to say, it got worse. The shit got worse.
Yeah, because I ain't gonna lie, I took it. I took Paxlovid, and it's like no joke. Like the third dose,
Yeah.
you cut clean. Yeah,
I was straight. I was knocked because I got knocked down the first time. I had a heavy fever, I had an immediate sore throat, heavy fever within like a few hours. Woke up the next day. I was at a conference. I couldn't even drive home. And then I got home and got that Paxlovid, and and then it took about 2 days, 24 to 72 hours, and then I was kind of like back. But I slept a lot. I was kind of out a lot, and then boom, I was up, and I was like, whew, And so I definitely would advocate, But then the other time I got it, I